Uncommon Sense with Junia Doan, sharing the wisdom and insight of those who have been there and done that.
Hello everybody, and welcome back to Uncommon Sense. A chance to be together and hear from real people talk about real life. With me today is Mike Rao, someone I've known for a few years now, and someone I admire for a number of reasons. Mike has a lot of dreams, and he works very hard to put them in reality. At the same time, he uses his energy to keep himself in a positive frame of mind, I would guess. And his vivid smile animates those around him. So welcome. Mike.
Thank you.
Before
I had better smile.
Yes, you better smile, at least a little. Before the program, we had started talking, and
Sure.
You had mentioned that your dad had died quite early.
He did. He was born and raised in India, first to go to college in his family, and he actually made it through medical school. And I think more than made it. I understand from talking with some of his former professors that he had actually done very well. And he started a little early, so I think he was only 20 when he became a physician. And he then got a fellowship to come to the United States. Showed up in the United States in New Jersey, I believe, and then moved into a quick residency in orthopedic surgery. Then he became a fellow of the Royal College of Surgeons in Edinburgh. Came back, finished that. He knew somewhere along in there that something was wrong. He was not feeling the energy that he had originally had. He had already married my mother at this point, and switched residencies into radiology because he could not take the hours of the orthopedic surgery residency. And then, unfortunately, he was about 31, maybe 32, and he died 3 months out of his residency. I was 4. My mother was in her early 20s, probably not very ready for the love of her life to die, and it was a challenge for us. But I remember several vivid moments. One was when I walked around the house one morning. My mother had gone out to get milk or something, and I think I was 4, maybe 5 at the most. But no, I would think it was 4. And I couldn't find her, I couldn't find anyone, and I was crying like most kids would.
Right.
And she had gone out, and I remember thinking to myself in this very, probably short period of time, but for me it seemed very long. I looked out the window and I thought, I'm by myself and I have to be responsible, and all of these messages that I had heard from adults previously were starting to set in. And many adults at that point, just prior to my father's death, were saying things like, you're going to have to be the quote-unquote man of the family and such. And there were all those sort of gender-oriented remarks that were made back in the late 60s. And probably still are in some corners now. But in any case, it set in, and it became obvious to me that I would have no choice but to be responsible and take charge. And then she came back into the picture, of course. It may have only been half hour later or something. And I really don't know, but it seemed like a long time to me. And then by the time I was about 8 years old, it was very clear that I needed to be pretty much fully in charge of what was going on, probably driving my mother crazy at that point. But in any case, things took a turn at that point, and I think I grew up probably more quickly than most people would at that age.
What do you mean it took a turn?
Well, I think the turn was that my father was a very nurturing, caring kind of person, probably was inclined to take care of a lot of things for me. And he and my mother played a very different role at that point when they were together with me in my life than afterward. Afterward, of course, when he wasn't there and she was struggling with his death, I had no choice but to take a turn toward being far more responsible, far more independent, and far more aware of the kinds of things that usually adults are aware of. And I did it, and I don't regret it. I certainly feel as though there were things that I was able to get out of it. And my personality ended up matching most of those needs very well that came at that point in my life. So,
What did you mean by things that adults become aware of?
well, like bills, for instance, that have to be paid because there is a due date, for example. The fact that somebody has to figure out how to go grocery shopping. I remember walking back and forth to the grocery store. It must have, it seemed like miles away to me as a child, but I'll bet it was only a mile away or so. And I would often do some of the grocery shopping, taking advantage of this opportunity, I suppose, to just be in charge. And I wasn't the kind of kid who did a lot of playing and that sort of thing. I probably should have done more of that, but I missed out on a lot of that because I had obligations. And I can't remember a time in my life when I wasn't. I think I've always been responsible for everything around me. And I think that's probably one of the reasons that it's been possible for me to, from 10 years back, be in these roles in larger institutions, because I think people want someone who is responsible and has a track record for being responsible.
Do you think it made you really prepare for things more than you might have or a child might have? I mean, it seems grocery shopping and bill awareness.
Oh, I'm sure. And then as you get older, you go from 4 to 8, you learn one set of responsibilities, and then beyond that you learn other responsibilities. I believe so, yes. I think that there were other events in our lives. We had a friend of my mother's who had 2 children. They had no place to go, no place to live. She took them in. They were at very different places in their lives. Nice kids, very nice kids, but had taken very different pathways than I had. And I, in many ways, became their parent. And I think that was yet another dimension in my life for a couple of years that I learned from. And I remember being at the same school with them and checking in on them in their classrooms during the time that I had recess to find out what was going on. And I remember the teachers thinking, this is a little strange. Why is this kid doing this? And I think that they realized that it was probably some kind of arrangement, and because those kids that I was checking on didn't mind, it ended up working well. And I was always pushing them on their homework and getting that done and such. And they just didn't have that same sense of urgency about getting things done. And so that added another dimension of responsibility in my life. And then as I got even older, I had an aunt who lived with us who was quite elderly and had broken both of her hips, and that was another entire set of responsibilities. And then my mother's brother, who lived with us, who is fundamentally mentally retarded, with a number of other serious complications, both physical and mental. He lived with us for quite a while as well, and I took care of him. So it's been, as I think about it, and I hadn't put all of those pieces together until talking with you, but as I think about it back to back, we've always had major responsibilities in our lives, and I think they came early and probably influenced who I am today.
In other words, it was early preparation.
I think so.
Because now you're a dad.
Now I'm a father and a husband, and also in a job that does require considerable responsibility. And there are times when I remember starting 10 years ago thinking that somehow I should figure out how to be responsible for and in full control of this huge organization back in California where I began. And there was really no way that you could do that without developing more techniques and certainly learning different ways of overseeing a large organization without being in full control of it. But I think that it helped push me to a point of developing a vision earlier on, and it certainly has helped me take responsibility not only for individuals but for the integrity of the institution, both academically and financially, and I've enjoyed that. I think it's been a good fit. I really don't know how I could possibly live life without some kind of responsibility. And I'm not saying that's good or bad, it's just the way I'm built. And maybe the way I'm built is based on what I've lived from the time I was young.
When you said you couldn't control a large institution, but you had to learn other ways, what were those ways?
Other people, allowing other people to be responsible for themselves, and certainly in empowering other people to be responsible for their units. I also learned that it is critical to hire someone who is responsible, organized, and experienced in their areas. I had a rule that I think worked very well for me in California, which was try to hire someone who is proven, solid, experienced, and preferably beyond 50 years old. And that formula ended up serving me very well. And there have been occasions in which a very well-qualified person comes along whom I sense will be ready for the job and is much younger than that. And I have taken them on into the team as well, and that's often worked out very well. Not always, but often.
How do you come to, in your job, say, or even in your marriage, to come to the decisions of where you want to take it or want to be in a few years with it?
I'd say in my marriage, it is very much a shared sort of relationship. So we decide that together. In a job or professional environment, most everything that has happened in my life has come along. And so I've been very fortunate, and I think largely at the right places at the right time, and didn't anticipate what the next step would be. I certainly hadn't anticipated coming to Central Michigan University, except that out of the blue, I got a call from a consultant who was looking for CEOs, and I knew her a bit, but not terribly well, and she just insisted that this would be the great match. And I said, well, we'll see. And then I happened to bump into a trustee named Roger Kessler in an elevator in our hotel where we were having a conference, and he quickly answered many questions that I had about the university and then shifted to more of a recruitment sort of mode. And I was very impressed with that. I thought, now this is a guy who will be a great partner, and certainly he's proven to be an outstanding partner in this institution. And really, it's been a great board, and that makes a huge difference for a guy like me in a position like this, to have a board that just lets you do what you need to do and focuses on the outcomes and the results. And so far, we have been very fortunate. In a short period of time, we've been able to make many good things happen. And again, I think it's because of having a good team in place. And if I attributed anything to myself, it's probably being a bit focused and pushy.
Oh, tell me about that.
Well, I think that focus is critical. You can have 1,001 goals. And the problem with that is, of course, no one knows which ones they're supposed to be working on, and typically no one has any idea of what goals come in which order and such. And so I have a lot of goals, but what I've done is I've basically put many of those to future years, and I've focused on the ones that are most important in consultation with my board, but also influencing my board, certainly telling them that I think certain things are important, such as research. It's a critical element to enhancing the classroom experience, for example. It's also critical to revenues for an institution. Revenues are, bottom line, very important to any kind of business, whether it is the business of higher education or the business of anything else. If we deny that, we're just kind of, I think, being clueless. But the pushy part is the part of pretty regularly checking. I've done this enough to know what should be happening at the end of a quarter, and I check in with a very numerical, quantitative, measurable number from a vice president or from someone at a different level who's responsible. And if I don't see that number, I certainly want to know why. And if it is because I suspect that someone is just not figuring out the roadmap, then I try to work with them on that and try to get them there. And ultimately, if you end up feeling like you've got a few of the wrong people on the bus, you have to move them off and get some of the right people on the bus who don't require as much in terms of reading that
Right.
roadmap and figuring out how to get to the outcome.
For your own students over there, or the greater student body, you've lived a life of responsibility. You've clearly said that, right, in goal setting.
I don't think so.
Do you try and share that, other than just being yourself, with your students? Because, no, I bring this up for a
Yeah.
particular reason. In the past years, we've had a lot of discussion of character in our society. Is it important, kind of be separated
Sure.
from job performance?
Sure.
How do you inculcate character?
Right.
And I was wondering what you thought about those questions.
Well, I think character is an important part of what we're trying to develop to the fullest potential of each individual's ability and opportunity at the university. We serve quite a large number still of individuals who come from families in which they're the first to go to college, first generation. And for many of them, their self-esteem is not at a point at which they believe enough in themselves in comparison to their academic ability. If they didn't have the academic ability, they wouldn't have gotten in. And I try to remind the freshman class coming in that there are 3,500, 3,600 of 13,500 applicants. Now, there are probably 700 or 800 in that applicant pool that we would love to have, we accept, and then they go elsewhere. But outside of that, most of these, anybody who's accepted has to be prepared for college. So they're ready, but they're often not as confident as they ought to be. And that's an important part of what we're doing.
They're not as what?
Is confident.
Confident.
As they ought to be. And my personal role is as much as I can make it. For an example is that last week the student newspaper reporters followed me around the entire day and basically shadowed me, asked me questions all day. It was interesting that we started out in the morning. They wanted to be there for the entire thing. We started out at about 6:30 in the morning, 6:45. Went for a run, finished the run. I dealt with my son's needs while they went and showered, and then they came back, and then we had an obligation on the campus in which I was to speak. And then from there, we zoomed to Lansing for scads of meetings and came back. I had an obligation back on campus again, and then a community obligation that night. And I think that the students captured it well in the newspaper, and I think they gave the university community a realistic view of what's going on, and they had a chance to ask me about some of the things that motivate me and drive me to live through these 15-hour days that I often have, and I thought that was helpful. I don't get as much exposure to 28,000 students as I would perhaps like. But then again, I also recognize that it's not realistic, and I frankly recognize that a university has to be about more than a university president. It's got to be about the learning experience. And
what do you teach your son?
In what way?
Well, you had a beginning life that's different from one that was planned for you.
Sure.
And so are you going to say, well, it worked for me, so...
I think my expectations...
Or do you go the other way and say it was more than I needed to have? And
I don't, in all honesty, and it's amazing to me when I look at him. I'm a believer in genes and genetic expression, because this is a little boy who reminds me a lot of just 35 or so years ago. And I want him to feel a sense of responsibility, and I think he does. I also want him to enjoy his childhood and have a good time. I don't think I didn't have a good time, but I certainly want him to have more access. The thing that I guess I regret the most is that I didn't have a chance to gain access to some of the learning resources that I think we're giving him access to. For an example, he's now 3, he'll be 4 next month, but he's in kindergarten because we didn't have another child. We didn't know at what pace they were supposed to learn, and he was in preschool. He kept advancing through these classes of preschool, and he could write, and he could do mathematics, and he could add and subtract, and He said, we're not going to stop him if he wants to continue, and he's made better friends with the kids who are older
Right.
than him. We're going to move him ahead. And we built into his sort of day this idea that homework is important and that learning is fun and challenging. And I remember there were times when I didn't think that learning was so much fun,
Right.
and that it was something to deal with outside of my other very common sense kind
Right.
of responsibilities, like
Right.
paying bills and so on. And I really don't want him to get into a
To
lot of
that.
that until later.
What are you teaching, or what did you learn about handling obstacles?
Well, I think that it's difficult for all of us. So, for us to pretend that any one of us just gets through them without feeling something, I think is probably a bit less than completely honest. I think that there are masters masters in terms of people who control their feelings. And we all have these feelings when bad things happen in our lives or difficult things happen in our lives. But to ignore them, I think, is a mistake, and sometimes that's the philosophy that you hear of, and I don't agree with that. I think to acknowledge it and to put it into the context of everything else going on in your life and everything else that life affords us. I mean, I feel like I've been one of the most fortunate people in the world. So when I have something bad happen, I try to remember that and try to remember that many good things have happened and that those really do outshadow the bad thing or moment that may be occurring. And I also try to think about the importance of my son and how I reflect those things that I'm dealing with on him. I try to insulate him from a lot of those. He's going to have plenty of obstacles to deal with. He doesn't need mine.
Right.
And it's hard. My wife, I'm probably less able to hide those things from her, and she's very sensitive, so she'll pick up on it. She'll say, okay, what's going on? And I'll tell her, and typically that feels even better yet. But all in all, I think that the best way to get through obstacles is to acknowledge them and to put them into context, and to indeed keep perspective on life and the fact that for most of us, there are many good things going on. I remember taking trips to places like China and India and looking around at people, recognizing that they are incredibly poor, they are incredibly humble, they have nothing, the vast majority of these populations, and yet if you take the time and can figure out a way to talk with them or have an exchange, you realize that they're pretty happy. And they're happy because they have a lot of love in their families, they have a keen sense of the culture that they are a part of. They may not be clean, they may not be well off, but they definitely have a lot of things that I think many of us take for granted. And we have, but we just don't appreciate. And if we take the time to stop, set our difficulties aside after we acknowledge them, and recognize that we have many of those wonderful things that every human being is basically afforded, then we'll probably have some appreciation for what we do have.
I heard you
and
say
get
something
through.
about the importance of love and culture.
I think it's critical, and I relate to that because in the Indian culture, I think it is, people will often say, that India is a very poor country, lacks infrastructure, lacks resources of all kinds, but there's lots of love. And that is true. And I'll also tell you that I could say that more easily 10 years ago than I can now. As Indians, many of whom have proven themselves to be very successful in environments that require intellect, have done well, and they've brought money back to India. I've sensed a movement away from the closeness to love and such. So I'm not saying that one is the opposite of the other. I think that it just has to be kept in perspective.
Balance. We want to thank Mike for being with us. He shared many important points with us, and that is adversity early on in life is not necessarily a negative, but in fact can be a great preparation for a full life ahead. He learned early on that responsibility was key in his family, but also for himself, and he took that on in every way he could. And as he has gone forward in life, he expects that of others as well as himself. And with the tremendous number of ideas that come his way, he picks and chooses very carefully, but he focuses with an intensity that he almost calls pushy. In other words, to see it through. In terms of his family life, his relationship with Monica, with his wife, is one of shared decision-making. Is that a fair, mostly fair kind
Definitely.
of comment? And with his son, to again teach that sense of responsibility, but to have a little bit perhaps more of the curiosity and school is fun attitude. And concerning obstacles in life, basically we all have them, and to see when things go hard for you that there are also really good things in your life, and to think about them and hold those dear. And while his family is of Indian origin and there was much love in that culture, still that is changing, and so really come back to balance. He's been to China as well, and no matter how poor, there was love and a sense of culture. So please, please remember, love is important, responsibility is important, and choosing the right things to do are important. So thank you so much for tuning in today. Thank Mike when you see him around, and remember, kindness counts. Please go out and do something kind for someone you know today and someone you don't know. See you next time, and thank you for tuning in. And thank you, Mike. That was a lot of fun.
It was fun.
To share your comments and suggestions, contact Junia. The email address is juniadone@aol.com, or write to Post Office Box 169, Midland, Michigan 48640.